Today is the 25th of April, 2016, and I'm interviewing Reg Birch, who I'll get him to introduce himself in a moment. My name is Ennis Barbery Smith, and this is an interview for the Chincoteague Island Life History Project here at the Museum of Chincoteague Island. Would you like to introduce yourself and say your full name?
My name's Reg Birch. I go by Reg Birch instead of Reggie Birch, and from Chincoteague Island.
All right, and when were you born?
4/14/1953.
Where were you born?
Nassauatix, Virginia.
Were your parents living on Chincoteague at the time?
They were.
What were your parents' names?
Reginald Birch, I'm a junior, and Helen Fletcher.
And what did your parents do on the island?
My father did many different things, but as we grew, he was in the Coast Guard. Stationed here for a while, stationed in Cape Hatteras, stationed in Florida, retired out of Hawaii. So I kind of grew up in Hawaii.
Was he born on the island, do you know?
I believe he was probably born on the island. Born in 1926. My mom was born in 1926.
Do you have siblings?
I do. I have two brothers. One older brother, Charlie Birch, and a younger brother, David Birch.
Which neighborhood did you grow up in on Chincoteague?
We grew up on South Main Street, 3 doors north of the fairgrounds, the carnival grounds.
Well, that must have been an exciting time at the carnival then.
It was. We always sat out front and watched the traffic go by, and of course we're always at the fairgrounds because my father was in the fire company, and I was always there working as a boy.
So your father was in the fire company. What did he do for the fire company?
Back then, I think most men, whatever needed to be done is what they did. He had training in electrical work, so during the beginning of the carnival before it opened, he would get all the lights working and get everything ready, microphone systems and such things as that. And he called bingo. That was his primary focus, was calling bingo.
Oh, that would be fun. Okay.
We used to be able to run up and down the aisles and collect the money and pass out the prizes as kids.
What kind of prizes did they have?
They didn't just have monetary prizes at that time. They had shelves and shelves of all kinds of, anywhere from dishes to clocks to stuffed animals to, many different things.
Did you ever win bingo, or were you not allowed to play?
Oh, you could play. You were allowed to play bingo, but also there was a gambling thing called the Big Six, and the kids couldn't go to that. That was a spinning wheel, and that was money, just money.
The Big Six? I've never heard of that.
Six.
No, how did that work?
It was a big spinning wheel, and it was dice, 3 dice in a row, 3, and you put your coins down between 1 and 6, numbers 1 and 6. Mm-hmm. And if you got 3 6s, you get $3, or whatever you bet. Quarter, minimum was a quarter, maximum was $1.
Okay. So what are some of your earliest memories of growing up on Chincoteague?
Oh, I guess living on the waterfront, catching crabs, having a little boat. I had a little Ira Hudson skiff that my parents had bought me for $25. We painted it baby blue, and we spent the summers in that. Swimming, and we had one of the few boat landings, we called it a launch ramp back then, was right across the street from the carnival grounds. So, and it was a big parking lot there. So we would run down and sit on the dock, and when the fishermen came, we were selling minnows. So we would run back to our property, scoop out a quart of minnows, run them back to the dock, and sell them to the fishermen that were going out. So the kids, my brothers and I, made a few dollars selling minnows very young. I'm talking about 6 and 7 years old, is all we were.
How much did the minnows go for? Maybe you said?
It was a quarter for a quart.
Wow.
Yeah, they're $5 now for a pint, I think. So
Yeah.
A quarter a quart.
And so that was just on your property. You could just scoop them.
Yeah, we'd set the pots out in front of the and put bread in the pots, and we could catch what we needed. And I think my father went out if we needed to have many gallons in the container, he would go out and catch them. I don't remember that, but the kids usually caught most of them. They were just everywhere. I mean, most most of the bay was full of all kinds of critters at that point. You know, flounders, you could go right out in front of the carnival grounds and catch flounder there, and crabs were very abundant. Most everything was abundant. And this is, I'm talking about in the 60s and 70s.
So you think you've really seen that decline?
Unfortunately, I tell people the surface of the water, there's not much left in the water column now, but the surface is what people enjoy now, and taking guided tours and seeing the ponies and that. But the water column was full of critters when I was growing up.
What other types of stuff do you have memories of catching? You know, other did you do crab pots? I mean, all kinds of things.
We went down to the local fish dock where they would clean fish, and that was a good area to gather for eels, and we would go down and catch eels off the end of the dock, and we ate eels. My mother would cook eels for us.
How did she prepare them?
We would fry them. Chincoteague is fried food.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have eel baskets over here, but you didn't catch them with a basket.
No, we used a tiny hook and drop the line down alongside the pilings, and they would be in the mud, and we would bring home 4 or 5 eels for dinner, and we all loved them. I mean, it was great. Yeah, it really was. Yeah. And hanging out at the fish dock. One of my first jobs was down at the fish dock, shoveling fish out of the bottom of the trawlers. Yeah.
How did you get that job? Do you remember going to apply for
My
it?
My father was always down towards the docks, and he just, would say, I think my son could come. And my father would get down at Chincoteague Inn. They call it Chincoteague Inn. It's long gone now. I would get on 11 years old and get up 4 o'clock in the morning and shovel oysters as well. They would come in down that way. So I worked on the water, basically. Worked around the water or on the water. Went clamming out in Tom's Cove as kids.
When you say shoveling oysters, is that
Forking oysters out of the trucks.
out of the
We
trucks?
couldn't, at that time in the 70s, we were not able to supply the market. So there were trucks coming from Louisiana, all the way from Louisiana. They would truck oysters here and bring them in a 6-wheel truck. And they would have younger men get in the back of the truck at 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, actually, because they started shucking oysters at 4 a.m.
Wow.
At 3 a.m. we'd get up and go down and fork oysters from that to the conveyor and into the house, and they would chuck them and sell them as Chincoteague brand, not Chincoteague oysters, but Chincoteague brand oysters.
Chincoteague brand oysters.
It's different.
Oh, is that the one? I'm seeing like Chincoteague Island brand right behind you. Is
That's
that's
the
the one?
Louisiana oysters. Yeah, and they were coming from the Carolinas as well, but we would always say the Louisiana oysters. You could tell by the shape of the shell and the color of the shell.
When were you first exposed to decoy carving? Or do
The
you
first
remember?
exposure, I guess, was going hunting just once or twice with my father. And, of course, that was the winter activity here. That's basically what we had to do, go ice skating or go duck hunting. And I was introduced, and I was lucky enough that my father, years before we had left to go to Hawaii, had owned a spot, a gentleman's agreement, because there was no owning of any duck blinds here in this region in Accomack County. I was lucky enough to acquire a spot just within walking distance off the causeway. So when we moved back here in 1966, I was 13 years old. My mother would drop us off, me and a friend, on the causeway, and we'd trudge across the marsh and go hunting out there. Yeah, so that's how I was introduced, and the need for decoys. The first set of decoys I made was with a friend of mine, and we were hunting what we call up the bay, and I sold them right out of the water. One of the guides had a couple so-called sports, were in the boat, and saw my little bufflehead sitting there and said, "Oh, who made those little guys? Would you consider selling a couple of them?" I sold a couple of them and realized, not only can I use them for hunting, I might be able to make a little bit of money.
How old were you then when
Let's
that
see.
happened?
Oh, I was in my 20s at that point. I started carving in 1977. But all along, I'd hunted since I was 13 or 14 years old.
Okay, so
And
then,
used plastic decoys and rubber decoys and carry lights and Victors. But the first inclination of making something wooden came with the need of not being able to buy the certain species that we wanted to hunt with that coming season.
do you remember what species that was?
They were actually just little buffleheads and hooded mergansers. You could not buy those. They at that point they weren't making them, or we didn't know where to buy them because we were just buying local decoys here from Parks Market.
Oh, okay. So then you said.
Yeah, there was no, Sears catalog you could, or Victor's or something like that, and they were mallards and such. But we were hunting fish ducks, which were eating minnows. Instead of
Okay.
the good pintails and the ducks that eat green, we were shooting because they were more abundant
Okay.
and easier for younger people to get to
Okay.
shoot. So I made a few decoys and sold them and realized, and at that time, of course, I had just started surfing in 1974, and said, not only can this provide income for financial reasons, it was for travel. It switched from interest in hunting, making working decoys for hunting. I saw it as a way to earn money to go surfing.
Okay.
It's a supplement.
Yeah, well, actually, if you can talk about the surfing, sort of the surfing culture here that got started, I guess, well, when did it get started?
It got started in the 60s. It started in the 60s. I wasn't involved in it. I started surfing in 1974, the year I got married, the first time. And moved next door to a surfer. They had been surfing a few years. And actually, the first surfboard I bought and wetsuit I bought came from duck money. Yeah.
That's interesting. I don't think I've heard
And
that.
of course,
before.
coming from Hawaii, I was already, an avid surfer. But I didn't really, that was in 66 as my father retired. I really didn't take it up until 1974.
So with the carving, did you ever go around to any of the older carvers' workshops and learn from them, or?
I started in the insurance business. It was funny, things seemed to kind of work out for me. I started in the insurance business in 1975. Fresh out of high school in 71, I was a carpenter. I helped build the Refuge Motor Inn, actually. That was one of my first jobs. And I was a carpenter, and then I went to Ocean City and worked up there for a few years in the high rises. And I got laid off Christmas Eve, 1975. So that's when I started. I ended up leaving the carpenter business and starting an insurance job because one day, sitting at my mom's house, the insurance agent walked in and said, "I'm about ready to retire. Wouldn't you surely like to, be an insurance agent?" And I said, "Not particularly, but if it pays well, I'll do it." Ended up doing 11 years. Great story, actually, because what it did was allow me to travel the island. I was basically an insurance agent here on the island. I had some business off, but I had taken over his route, and it was a book carrying route that you actually went door to door and sold insurance and collected it. And one of my clients was Court McGee. I would visit him once a week, and Lola, his wife. That was weekly insurance. I would actually go there and collect a small amount of money once a week. And another one of my clients was Cigar Daisy. Yep. And I would collect him from Lucy, his wife, every Wednesday afternoon. And I'd make a point to go after his nap, because he always took a nap, and I wanted to catch him in his workshop. If I went too early after lunch, he was napping, so I'd always wait later and always walk in his workshop. And started making my work, trying to make my work, my hunting decoys look like his. And he was always advising me, get your own style, get your own style, get your own style. And don't ever decide to do this full time. You will end up cutting grass before you end up making decoys. And it did come true. I really, for a while, I would end up trying to find something else to do besides make decoys, because I started getting orders for a lot of decoys. So I was lucky enough to have a couple, 3 people here on the island that were carved. And one of the most influential people was a classmate of mine, lived across the street from my mother-in-law. And I saw him in his workshop one night, and I took one of my decoys over to him, and he encouraged me a lot. And his name was Rotary. Yeah, he encouraged me a lot. And said at that time he was in the Navy, and he was just coming back and forth. He was stationed, I think, in Norfolk. But just by coincidence, I saw him and walked across the street to speak with him, and I had a decoy with me and showed him, and he encouraged me. And I still have that decoy, actually. So I had encouragements all along the way.
Yeah, Rose seems to really have encouraged a lot of people.
He has, yeah. I was lucky too. I was lucky enough to have people. Once I started and became, people started knowing that I had tools and would accept people come in my shop. I had several people come in, and I didn't necessarily teach them everything, but encouraged them.
And where was your shop? Because I know you said you grew up on South Main Street. By then,
Yeah, when I got married, I moved, well, in 1981 I moved up in Depot, which is Circle Drive, off of Circle Drive. And it's out on the water. I had a workshop out on the water. Called a studio, because it was more of a studio than it was a workshop. Now, my power tools were in another section where I painted and carved, was out over the water. So yeah, that's in Depot.
you mentioned some advice Cigar gave you about not being a carver.
He did. I would sit there and watch him, and I thought he was the cat's meow. I really did, because he was winning contests, he was judging at the Worlds, and he was by far the most famous person that I had met, and said, well, if he can do this, maybe I should make my work look more like his, and it would sell. But it didn't take me long, about a year. I said, this is not the way I want to go. But I went through several different stages in my career. At that point, when I met him, it was a trade secret. People wouldn't tell you where you could supply wood. It was impossible to find out where people were buying the wood. So I started making miniatures. My first show was 1977 in Virginia Beach, and I'd taken about maybe 8 or 10 pair of miniatures, because that's all I could find wood for. And actually, I was finding it dunnage off of acetate. It was old mahogany that was floating up on the beach, and from pallets, and it was relatively soft, and it was called the endorsed mahogany, and that's where I made miniatures, and it was a 100% failure. I sold absolutely nothing at the first show I went to. So it was very discouraging, my miniatures. My first show I sold 0, and I anticipated selling out, and I sold nothing.
Well, that's good encouragement for someone else to hear.
It is. So you could still make it. I persevered. The next year I went back and sold a few things, and then I said, well, maybe, because they had a wonderful show down in Virginia Beach back in the 70s and early 80s. They had the largest competition. It was actually bigger than the Worlds at that point. I think it was anyway. But it was held at a big convention center. And it was great. They had big exhibits and competition, and they were just starting to formulate the rules and regulations for working decoys. So I competed there and won several ribbons, and that too helped me along in my career. Yeah.
So you started out really with working decoys.
Started working, then went to miniatures because I couldn't find enough wood to make. Yeah, and I made miniatures for a little while, not too long, because I realized that I wasn't going to be a world champion, and I couldn't. The decorative, because you wanted to make them fancy, and I was more into using hand tools and not power tools, and I needed little power tools and such to make miniatures that would sell. So I went back to working decoys and started competing. That way I could start selling my working decoys at shows. They weren't really used. I haven't made maybe 200 decoys that have ever been actually used over my career. But I'm known for decoys, working decoys.
And for that style, that's interesting. How would you describe your style? We were just talking about this, how it's hard to
Well,
pin down.
archaic, it really is. It's made in the old tradition. And as I said before, we were talking in your office, that there's decoys that have sold almost to $1 million now. There's hundreds of decoys that sell for tens of thousands of dollars, and not everyone can afford that. So I got to a point where people were asking me, because I was doing restoration work, and they said, well, I want to sell this once you restore it. Can you make me something that looks like this? And that's how it turned. And that turned in 1986. It's a great story how I made a change in career. I've always had 2 careers until I moved to Berlin. But in 1977, I started insurance. 74, I started insurance business. Started carving in 77. And in 1986, my wife was pregnant with our child. And that was 11 years of the insurance business. I was standing in my studio, and my boss had his boss come in from Richmond, and they wanted to see Chincoteague. And he said, well, while we're on Chincoteague, we should at least go to the home of one of my agents. They come to the back door, come to my door, my shop door, and lo and behold, I turn, and I'm standing at the workbench with my dress clothes on, with my tie on, with an apron, standing there painting a decoy. And my boss walks in and he says, I hear you've been moonlighting. He said, guess what? You're either going to have to stop carving and take up the insurance business a lot more serious, or not be in the insurance business. And I turned right and looked right at him, and I said, I give you 2 weeks notice. My wife was 6 months pregnant, and two weeks notice. And he said, yeah, no, you're kidding. After 11 years, you're not going to do this. And I said, yeah, I think I'll do it. But I was lucky that over the years, I had acquired a client that lived in St. Michael's. He was in the antique business, and he was like a second set of parents. He and Jenny, his wife's name, and they were buying my decoys right along, selling them in the antique shop. So I picked up the phone and I called him. I said, I quit my job today. I said, can you start buying more than what you've been buying from me? He said, Reggie, you know that I could have handled double, triple of what you had been making your output. I said, why, sure. He said, we'll come down and if you want to sign something, I'll sign something for a year's contract and I'll buy everything and anything that you make. So that's what really got me started, was the ability to just be able to drop the insurance job and start carving full time in 1986. And of course, what I was making at that time was I was just about making the transition from making working, fancier looking ducks to old beat up looking decoys, to fit on the tables and the coffee tables and the dressers of old furniture and old mantels. And that's what worked out perfect, because, and they handled my work maybe for 7 or 8 years after that. And the same year, one of his customers was also on the board of the Waterfowl Festival in Easton. And it was really, really difficult to get in at that time. 1986 was a big waiting list to get in. You had to know somebody. And he called Lance Strasberg and gave him a resume and showed him a little bit of my work, and I was accepted immediately. So that November, I guess this was in the summer, I was standing to my workbench. I got to go to the Easton Festival for the very first time, and last year was my 30th year full time. I haven't missed it even since I left the country. I've been coming back. This is 30 years for me. And that show in the 80s and 90s was making me a half year's living. I could go there and sell what I made, always sold out, never, ever, ever brought anything home. If I didn't sell it to retail, I would have a wholesaler or dealer come over and say, Reg, anything you have left, I would be glad to take it from you. Because everyone said that I've always sold my product at a reasonable price, and they could do well with it. So it's in 1986, but this is my 30th year full-time carving.
Do you think that was the peak of the, or maybe it's still to come, but as far as, the decoy market going up and down?
That was the peak. I've said, probably others have a different way of saying it, but I said that you could take a sweet potato and paint it like a duck and sell it.
In the 80s and 90s?
That's what I've told people. In the 80s? Oh yeah. I was the first president of the Carvers Association in 1983. And when we started, it was Tommy Savage and myself. We got this bright idea that there were so many carvers on Chincoteague, and as I said before, it was difficult to find wood. And we thought, well, maybe if we started ordering wood in bulk, and paint in bulk, and paint brushes in bulk. So that's how the Carvers Association started, was to get everyone together and make massive orders and eyeballs and all the stuff that we were using. That was the whole premise of that. And it did not work out because everyone's an individual. It's like watermen. They want to go off on their own and do their thing. Duck carvers, we found out, were very individualized. They were artisans. They didn't want to. There's also secrets. You had certain techniques that you used, and we thought maybe we would all get together and share it. It didn't work out that way. But I was the president of 1983 and started that process. But at that time, we had 43 carvers on Chincoteague. People were actually quitting their job working over at NASA because it was such a market for decoys. Because every magazine you opened up, you would watch a TV program, and in the background of the lawyer's bookshelves, you'd see a duck. So it was everywhere, and you could sell almost anything. So I hit it right at the right time to start full time.
Yeah, and 43 carvers. Sorry, go ahead.
There were 43 carvers, And then we said, well, it's not, because it started out as the Chincoteague Decoy Carvers Association. Then we said, well, we should open the door. Say, we do have some painters here on the island, some two-dimensional artists. So we opened the door and said, well, please, we will, accept this. And at that point, we were also deciding to have scholarship for the art student at Chincoteague High School, because my first wife was a school teacher there, and we got involved in that and promoting what we did through the arts, and went up and I actually did a few demonstrations through the art class and such.
Is that scholarship still going on?
It's still going on. It
That's
sure is.
great.
Yep, and it's called the Chincoteague Decoy Carvers and Art Association. And also, we were naive to think, oh, you have to be from Chincoteague, because we had outside people from just, on the other side of the causeway saying, why would you, not allow us? We had guys from Saxes, and we had some Pocomoke carvers. We had Salisbury, actually ended up one of the driving forces for the whole thing. It still goes on. Is John and Cindy Walls. Mm-hmm. They are still involved in the Carvers Association as far as I know, and they're from Salisbury.
Yeah, I think I've met them. Yeah.
Because he came down and presented his knives. He took over a business called Knott's Knives. He must have been a cousin, because he calls it Cousins now, but it was called Knott's Knives at the time. And he would come down and sell us knives, and he drove. So, and then we just said, well, it really doesn't matter if you're a carver or not. If you want to be involved in this, you don't have to, as long as you pay your dues, you don't have to be either. Just belong to this organization.
So it got bigger and bigger.
It got bigger and bigger, and at that time, the Chamber of Commerce was doing this Easter Decoy Festival, and we were getting less and less participation from the chamber members. So we got the idea, as the Carvers Association, that we would start setting up the show, taking down the show, and running the contest. And at that time, I was the president. So I was also a member of the chamber. So I was kind of the go-between the Carvers Association and the decoy, the chamber. So for a couple, 3 years, myself and Hal Lott ran the decoy carvers. The decoy show, Easter decoy show. And on board along that way came Donna Leonard. She was a collector, and of course was a major member, if not the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce. And she started getting involved, and it didn't take too long, a couple of years. I think she ended up taking it now. She's had it for 25 or 30 years. She's been doing it.
Yeah, she's had it for a long time.
So it all kind of fit together over these years. And like I said, when you go to our show, it was primarily local people that were doing our show, because we juried it. We had 90 exhibitors, and there were waiting lines to get in that show. The high school was full, the halls were full, the gymnasium was full, and we had to, go through the applications and pick the people we wanted. There were so many people who wanted to come to our show.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you remember any of the shows that were held, I think, by the National Wildlife Refuge?
Oh, yeah.
So
Snow
can
Goose
you
Festival.
talk about those?
The Snow Goose Festival. That's sort of the first I got exposed. I started carving in '77, and the first show I went to was down in Tom's Cove. I had never attended one, to my knowledge, over at the refuge. I don't think I did anyway, but I vaguely remember maybe the Snow Goose show down at Tom's Cove had stopped, and they moved it over to the refuge for 1 year. But they were having, they had a competition, a painting competition, and a decoy head carving competition, and I went and entered that kind of thing. Yeah, that was called the Snow Goose Festival, and then it got switched from the Snow Goose Festival to the Easter Decoy Festival.
Oh, I see. I didn't realize that was an evolution
It's the same
of that.
as an evolution of that.
Okay,
It
okay.
was.
One other, question I've been thinking about as you were talking earlier was, people who want these older-looking decoys, even if they're not really older, but they look like they're antique, or they look like they've been used in some way. What do you think the attraction is for that?
That's a good question. Well, I think when they buy something from me and it appears, just like I told you before, I make all models and makes of different makers. Not I guess what is it? Imitation is the best form of flattery. I guess that's how you say this. I think that's, if I make it close enough that, when they have company come in their house, it's easy for them, just like this big I just made a Canada Goose for someone that sold. The original one sold for $800 and some odd thousand. And I think what's great is they can pick this up and show it to their, someone they're having dinner with. Is, well, Reg has made this, but it's in likeness of a decoy that's really important in the decoy world, and they have that. I basically, I guess that's what it is, and it fits in people's homes. If you've got antique furniture, you don't want a decorative with all the feathers burned in and everything. You want something that matches your sitting on the hearth that looks like it's actually been used but not. And also, I guess the main objective is they know what's happened in the decoy world is they've gotten so expensive that you really don't know what you're buying. You can go to an auction and you purchase something, and it may have been redone by somebody, maybe even me, and you've spent a lot of money, and then when you buy it, someone comes up and says, well, they didn't look like that when we saw it the first time. So when they buy something from me, they know what they've got. That's what they tell me. The collectors say, when I put this on my shelf and I know I paid you $500 or $600 for it, I know that it's your work, not something that was supposedly made 100 years old that's been freshened up or has a new head on it. So they know what they get.
That's really interesting. That is really sort of transparency. They know.
Yes.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah, because there's been several things that have been sold over the years, illegitimately and also unbeknownst. And there's all kinds of ways now to determine. When I go to the shows and go to the auctions now, I'm not hounded, but I'm asked several times, would you mind go looking at this decoy and tell me if you've worked on it or if you've seen it in a different state than it is now, and make sure it's represented as it says in the auction book. Yeah. Now, private sales, I certainly can't do that. I can't go because it's a problem to go in someone's home and say, well, you're trying to sell something that's incorrect. But at an auction, it's there for everyone to look at. I've gone in and of course they sell decoys still that's broken, and they take me over and say, what will it cost me to repair this and bring it back to the way it should be? So I'm in the restoration business too, because that's what I did when I was a younger man. I restored furniture. I worked on old furniture. That was my craft. That's what I really like to do coming out of high school. I really like working with hand tools, and that's all I use. I'll use electric light, and that's basically all I use. So everything's back to the old tradition.
So was that furniture restoration a career at one time?
No. It was just something. I made Windsor chairs, and I would go to an antique shop and something would be beat up and battered, and I loved antiques, and I would restore them and put them in my home. Yeah, put them, fix up. If it's got a chair with 3 legs, I would make another leg for it. Things like that.
Oh, one question I was going to ask earlier. So when you did quit your insurance job and you transitioned from that to a carver full time, what did your wife say then, or your family? Did they think you were crazy at the time?
Well, I didn't get a whole lot of response. They knew that I'd already been carving for 9 years, and they knew that I could make this switch. And about that time, I'd started in the clam business as well. So I've always had 2 irons in the fire, really. Working for myself. I've always worked for myself, with the exception of working for the insurance agency. But I was a satellite office anyway, so I basically I made my own hours when I was in the insurance business as well. I'd have to go in once a month into an Hancock. But and the word was getting out. The more I was doing, there were people buying things from me that the word got out that I was working on decoys and selling. Because it just started out, as I said, as just a hunt with, and I realized that, boy, can I travel. And that's what I've done extensively, and still do this today. As you can, we'll talk about that too, where I live now. So.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Actually, let's talk too about, before we get to that, Elder Hostel. You said that was part of your...
I did Elder Hostel. I did. Charlie Petroni introduced me to Elder Hostel. I think it was one of the very first programs. Yeah. Yes, programs.
Attempts. It was an attempt, I'm sure.
It was an attempt, and I had no knowledge of it, and he came to my workshop once because we'd hunted and fished together a little bit. And he said, "Got a project for you." He said, "I want you to come up and speak in front of a group of people, and I want you to make a duck while you're sitting there. And I said, Charlie, I'm not a public speaker whatsoever. He said, well, I'm going to help you along the way. I said, I cannot. I said, I remember when I was in high school, I couldn't even get up and do a book report, let alone sit in front of someone. He said, but the situation is, it will be different because you know what you're doing, you know what you're talking about. And he said, I'm going to go up and I will be beside you and I will follow your progress and ask you questions and get you started. And that guy, he comes up and he introduced me. I get all set up. I get my chopping block out, my hatchet, my carving knife, because I did not paint there. I only carved. Got my block up there, and he walks up. He's standing in the back of the room. And he walks up, and I want to introduce you to about 30 professional people there, because the people that do Elder Hostel are remarkable people. Mm-hmm. They're senior citizens, but still want education. They still just drink it in. Mm-hmm. And he comes up and he introduced me. He puts his hand on my shoulder. He said, "This is Reg Birch, one of the local carvers." He said, "I'm going to let him take the show now." And he walked out of the back room and closed the door, waved at me and closed the door and left. And I had an hour to sit there. It was the very first. He walked right out. He stuck his head in about 50. He said, "Reg, I'm going to give you an hour." Stuck his head about 55 minutes later and said, "Looks like you made it." And of course I finished up and everybody said, "We don't know why," because the first thing I said is, "I'm not a public speaker. You all are going to have to ask questions to get anything out of me." But I'm doing like you did in this interview. I just ramble on. No. But so yeah, I did several of those, and then the Marine Consortium got wind that we were doing them, and I was also doing them for that as well as this museum. Right. So I did them for maybe 5 or 6 years. Several of them. I mean, sometimes 8 and 10 a year. Yeah. Doing those. Yeah.
Do you think that affected? Not affected. I mean, that's not the right word. But how sometimes when you're forced to talk about something, it makes you think more about why you do things certain ways, or I don't know. Do you think it would have? Not really. Mm-hmm.
No. Mm-hmm. But the spinoff too. Of course, Charlie was involved at the War Museum, and I started teaching classes up there. I must have taught 15 or 20 classes up there. Like I said, in the 80s, there were just lots of people wanted to learn how to do this to supplement their income and as a hobby. And so I started teaching classes up there, a 3-day seminar, and I did several of those as well. But I got so I could sit in front of people and work, because I love to sit in front of people and work. Because when I did the decoy show up at the high school, the Easter decoy show, I would always set up and work. I remember once they got me to work nearly the whole time. And as you see, most of the carvers here on the island are watermen, and I guess just by looking at the persona, that the way they present themselves, they have camouflage clothes on, and they look like decoy carvers. They really do, And I remember I put on a coat and tie and made decoys up on the stage at the high school, and all the carvers they just thought that was the funniest thing ever seen. And I said, "Look, I consider myself a professional. I'm a professional artist. I'm not just a duck carver." So I went up and I put on my coat. Now eventually I took my tie off, but I wore some of my clothing that I had in the insurance business, and I was up there with a hatchet and chopping decoys with a coat and tie on, and it just to prove a point to say, you don't have to wear hip boots, and spit tobacco in a can to make ducks. You can move on. And that's basically the theory I've taken throughout. Is it's because they ask me on my RRS forms what do you do? I'm not a duck carver. I'm an artist. And I've had confrontations with the U.S. Customs about that since I've been traveling. Yeah. That's another long story. But yeah.
Well, yeah, actually, since you're talking about customs and stuff, how did you end up moving, or what was your trajectory for where you've lived as an adult? Maybe that's a good way to ask it.
Well, I've always traveled, as I said before in the beginning. I realized that making this extra money, I could travel. And I was lucky enough that I'm going to call him a student actually, a young man was in the Coast Guard here on the island, and we were surfing together. He was from Clearwater, Florida. His name was Kevin Williams. This is back in the 80s. We were surfing one day, and I said, the surf was good, and I said, "Well, I'm going to go grab some lunch at the house. You're welcome to come." So he came, eating lunch, and I said, I've got to run out the shop and do a little something before we go back surfing. And he walks in my shop, he was a radioman, and he'd never seen a duck decoy from Clearwater, Florida, not a hunting zone, not at all. Never even seen what a duck decoy looked like. And I went in and did something, I can't remember exactly what it was. We went back surfing. A couple of days later, we saw one another. He said, I've got a question. He said, I went in your workplace there. He said, what were you doing? What were you working on? I said, duck decoys. And he said, what is a duck decoy? I said, for hunting purposes. And I explained why you have duck decoys for hunting ducks. And he was here stationed a couple of years, and he got the idea that he was going to move to California and start a boat towing service. But in the meantime, I had taught him. He'd come to my shop every 3 hours. A single man came to my shop for 2 years. Every single hour he could spend with me, he spent with me. And I taught him to carve and paint. And when he moved to San Diego, it wasn't long before he was surfing on a regular basis. And I started going out there twice a year, 3 times a year, 4 times a year, putting a suitcase full of empty decoy blanks, and sitting on the beach with him, carving, watching, waiting for the surf to get good. And I earned a living while I was out there sitting on the beach carving. I've got to say probably more hours on the beach carving when I lived here than I did in my workshop. I would always walk up on the north end of the beach and sit there and carve. Not large, big pieces, but I would carve duck heads and miniatures and all sorts of things that I knew I could put in a backpack and a carving knife. And I even had a little block of wood up there with a hatchet that I would hide, and I would work on the beach. I'd have a fishing pole with me if the fish were good, fishing was good, or I'd have a surfboard with me. And I'd surf, and I'd always catch the best waves because I was sitting there waiting for the tides and the wind to get correct. So that's how I ended up sitting on the beach. But that's how I met my second wife, sitting on the beach carving.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. So did she come up and ask you what you were doing, or how did it?
No, odd story. It's a very romantic story, actually. She was visiting friends in Washington, D.C., her parents' age. And they had planned a trip. She had come from Berlin, Germany, to stay with them for a week. And they had planned, unbeknownst to her, planned a trip for a couple days down here. And she, as a young girl, had vacationed with her parents up on the North Sea on a little island called Zoot Island. And it's the North Sea, so it's not a lounging beach. It's not a beach where you put a towel out and get the sun. It's a beach where you beach comb, you put on a slicker and little boots, and you walk along the edge of the surf line and you just strolled. And that's what she thought beach was all about. She wasn't a beach person that just sat with a radio and cooler. When she came to a beach, she walked. So when they dropped her off, they sat on the regular beach. Being Americans, they sat on the regular beach with their beach chairs. She took off and started walking north, and I usually was about 2.5 to 3 miles north of the parking lots. And it was on that particular day she was walking on the beach. It wasn't a really particular nice day. But I was sitting up on the dune lines, and she walked past, and there was a piece of driftwood setting out, I guess, on the edge of the surf, and she sat down, and I'm thinking, wow, this is really strange. There's no one around for a mile in either direction, and this person sat right down in front of me. And so I got up, and with a carving knife and the decoy head in my hand, and walked north of her about 100 yards and stood there on the edge of the waterline. Instead of her turning and going back to the populated beach, she walks past me, and I'm standing there, and I said, boy, you're a long way from civilization. And she spoke, and of course, in German accent, and she said, it looks like you're working with wood. And I said, yes, I'm making, decoys, duck decoys. And she said, I see them in all the gift shops here. Would it be possible for me to buy something from you? Remembrance of my trip here on Chincoteague Island. I said, I don't have anything, but I'll be glad to give you my website. That was in 2002. Rather than sit there and talk, we talked a couple of minutes. She started walking north and getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and finally just disappeared. Maybe about 4 hours later, this person comes back. We'd only spoken a couple of minutes, and I said, maybe you could buy from my website. She comes back, and she walks, instead of walking on the surf line, she walks over to me again and said, I'd really like to buy something from you. Is there anything in the shop? I said, no, I don't have a thing. She said, well, it's too bad because I'm going back to Germany. Because at that point, I didn't even know she lived in Germany. She said, I'm going back to Germany in a couple of days, and I'd like to take something with me. I said, there, I have nothing, and I did not. So that was 202. And in the meantime, between 202 and 206, I'd separated from my first wife and had moved out. And 4 or 5 days later, the phone rings after I'd moved out, and it's my second wife, now, calling and saying she was either coming back to Chincoteague. And she came back to Chincoteague and stayed in a bed and breakfast, and we met on the beach a couple times and talked. And I ended up getting divorced first time, and I said, what am I going to do myself? Here she is in Berlin. I had no knowledge of going, but the best thing for me to do, I said, is get away from Chincoteague. I was a little bit upset about being divorced, so I put on a backpack and flew to Paris and called her from there, and that was in 2007. And one thing led to another, and I came back after staying there for about a month, came back and packed a few suitcases full of working decoys and moved over there. And I've been there for 9 years.
Wow, yeah, you've been in Berlin for a while then.
9 years, yeah. So I've met, Aztecs have been really good to me. You know, I've hunted there, I've fished there, I've surfed there, I've beachcombed there, and now I've got a second wife I've met from there.
On Assateague.
Assateague is an important place. And I was just noticing up on one of your walls here, you've got all the shipwrecks, and I noticed there's the Kitty up there with Maryland, Virginia line. That's my ancestors were wrecked on that ship, and that's how I ended up here. That's the first mention of Birches.
So what year was that?
1764, 1763.
Oh, was it? Wow. Okay. And so that shipwreck. Where was that ship coming from, or going? Do you know?
You know, I've done my genealogy, and the first when I went down to Accomack County and started doing some search. Of course, it wasn't long before they said. I spoke with the person that was in charge of all that, and he said, well, if you're a Birch, he said, chances are you came from that shipwreck, because that's the first mention of the Birch family on eastern shore of Virginia. And he said they were there for a few years and started the Birch Salt Works. And that's how we ended up on Assateague, saying Assateague. So my ancestry goes back to 1763. I assume I'm English-Irish. I assume by my name, Reginald, and Birch, of course, is English. And Reginald, of course, is English. Yeah. But the whole family look Irish. You know, I look Irish. And now, since I moved to Germany, some people say I'm more German-like. My wife even says you're more German-like than she is.
That's interesting.
Very regimented and on time, and yeah.
So when you meet people in Germany, do they have any context for decoy carving? Is that wildfowl hunting?
It's not something, but when I first got there, unlike this country, you have to prove yourself there. Many, many hoops you have to jump through, and one of the few things, or one of the several things, with the immigration is you have to make a living there. That was a basic thing. You have to be able to support yourself. You have to, of course, not be leaving a family behind. So they had to look in your background there. They have to make sure you have health insurance. You don't have any big bills. They do many, many checks on you, you know. And one of the things first was, well, what you're going to have to do if you're going to live here is you have to earn money here. So that was the first year, and Uta and I, my wife, we struck out, and I went to the North Sea and found an antique dealer who wanted to carry my work. I went to what we would call the Fifth Avenue of Berlin, and just one block off of that, I found a really nice studio that would carry my work. And I was lucky enough that one of my wife's sisters lived in Cambridge, England, and there is a gallery there established in 1730, 40, something like that. It's been there, called the Primavera. That their idea of their gallery is you have to be from Cambridge, England, in order to put your pieces in there, or be associated with Cambridge, England. So I went in and showed a little bit of my work, and he was carrying a guy's work by the name of Guy Taplin from Essex, England, and shorebirds and such. And when he said, well, I would really like to take your work on, he said, but you have no ties to Cambridge, do you? And about that time, my future brother-in-law at that time was not, came in and said, oh, he knew him, and he introduced himself. Oh, of course, you come in here every week, looking for something. Well, how will you know Reg? And I said, well, he's my wife's sister is his fiancée. Ah, he goes, this is perfect. We can get tied. So I ended up putting my stuff there. So I actually had taken them out now, but the first 3 years, I had 3 galleries. I had one in Cambridge, England, got one up in the North Sea on the island of Zut, which is called the Hamptons of Germany, and then one just off of what we would consider there, the Fifth Avenue. So I had success. I was selling things there. But realized that my name is much more important here than it is over there. And that's what sells a lot of my work, is my name carved in the bottom of these birds. It's just as important as what they are. Mm-hmm. Because over time, the value, thank goodness, the value of my work has increased, and it needs my name on the bottom. Over there, I'm just a nobody, carving artwork, and it didn't matter if I had my name on it or not. Mm-hmm. And I was getting far less money over there. So after, I'd worked here for 25 years at that point, and to try to build a clientele over there was going to be very difficult. So the next year we go back to the immigration office, and we had gotten all kinds of contracts and resumes, and I had all kinds of, I had my resume and everything to present to the immigration people of what I'd accomplished that year in order to make a living there. I go back, and the second immigration office lady said, I don't know why you went through all this. There is such a thing as the internet, and we don't care where your funds are raised. It doesn't matter if the United States, wherever, you meet our criteria, and it really doesn't matter where your funds are raised. The first lady I met, to the contrary, she wanted me to earn my money in Europe, specifically Germany.
Oh, wow.
But the second lady was like, she was a younger person, and said, and she called her by name. She said apparently she has never heard of eBay or the internet, because this is so old school that it doesn't really matter as long as you earn enough money
to get by.
Yeah. So it wasn't long before I started calling my pieces back in, because logistically it was very difficult. One of the shops was 8 hours away by train, and I didn't like that. I never consigned anything in my life anyway, and it did not go too well with me leaving my product with someone thinking that they're the ones that had to sell it. If they had bought it outright, it would be perfect, but they said, we can't do this.
So now you sell primarily or exclusively online, and at shows? At
shows, I sell online, but I just had sold, just before I came back in March, I had shipped 2 decoys to Southampton in England. Someone ordered a couple birds, and now I've got an order for 10 birds in the Netherlands. Someone contacted me through Facebook and wanted me to make 10 birds for them, and we've got to sign a contract to get it going, but I've got 10 birds to make, and I'll be sending these off to the Netherlands. So I'm all around.
Yeah. And you talked about, your name is really what will sell it, but I think there's also, or some of the interviews I've done, it's also Chincoteague, maybe not as much for you, but for other carvers, to have that Chincoteague name.
It's very important. I've lost a lot of customers because of that.
Really? Can you talk about the importance
I have. I would go to Easton, and of course they see my business card. I've got a business card with Chincoteague, and then on the reverse I've got Berlin. And people would come up and say, boy, I really like this. Was this made on Chincoteague, or was it made in Germany? And the first thing, of course, they want to know what kind of wood it is. They pick it up and go, is this cedar? I say, yes, it's from North Carolina or New Jersey. Well, are you buying wood in Germany? No, I'm not buying wood in Germany. I'm taking my wood over and making my birds. And then the next question, well, did you work on this in Germany, or did you work on it in the States? And some people walked away and said, well, this bird is actually a European bird because you made it over there, and I'm not really interested in buying it. I prefer to buy something that was made in the USA, made by an American, instead of being made overseas. So I have actually lost, not too many. At first it was happening, but now the customers after 8 or 9 years have come back to me and said, we like your work regardless of where you work on it. Because most of the time I don't finish off my product completely there. It's some of the nuances that I have to do, I do here to finish it. So it's been, and it's you know, it leaves here, it gets worked on, it's finished here, you know. So yeah, but yeah, it's a change. Now I did find a few things. I'm starting to make a few songbirds just because it's easier to transport, and I found wood over there. But they went really quick. I made 22 of them this time to bring back, and I sold them quite quickly.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's, yeah, people are really particular, and you know, and yeah, because I still say, because I had that on my website for a while, you know, I was more proud at that point leaving here and going to Germany, and I would put that on my first you know, living in Germany, making decoys in Germany, and people were saying, Reg, you know, they come up to me and say, Reg, maybe that's not the wisest thing to do, is to put, you know, is to put that you're working exclusively out of Germany now, instead of you're still got your roots here in Chincoteague.
That is very interesting.
It is.
Yeah, so that's the tradition. And that brings up the question, too, that I think, Krista and I have talked about before. And, you know, is there any kind of a Chincoteague style? Or maybe, I think there's two parts of it. There's sort of, is there a Chincoteague culture to decoy carving and tradition?
It's the culture. It's, yeah. It really is. Oysters, we were talking about earlier. Oysters, it's something about you adding this name.
What that
I
means.
think it is a mystique, you know, because we are a, you know, a hunting community, a waterman, a fisherman community, and that's what we were piggybacking on, I think. It's the same as I was going to say about the oysters, you know. There's oysters coming from all over the country being brought here to be opened and canned here because of the Chincoteague brand, or the Chincoteague name. And I think that's what's really happened with decoys as well, because, you know, we've had 3 really important carvers over the earlier part of the market hunting years, you know, and Ira Hudson and Doug Jester, Miles Hancock, and of course a living legend here, Cigar Daisy, of course. So we actually have 4. And Corbin Reed. There's many, you know, if you look at the old maps of all the carvers around here, and it was. They went through a renaissance as well. They were market hunters, and then when the ducks started disappearing, they started carving for the tourist industry. And they would have a picnic table setting out in front of their house with their little carvings out, and tourists would stop in and buy them. So it's the, yeah, I think Chincoteague is an important part. Because people come, first time they meet me, you know, they look at my business, oh, Chincoteague, I've been to Chincoteague, of course I have, you know. It's a remarkable how many people know Chincoteague. It really is. I've even met people in Germany, you know, that have heard of Chincoteague. Yeah, it's remarkable. But oysters, I mean, that was a very, they've said, you know, that was one of the selling points. Chincoteague oysters, Tom's Cove oysters were the best. It's not necessarily always true, but because there's oysters, you know, up and down the East Coast, they're really good. But yeah, and of course, Crisfield was the same way. The awards came from there. If you came from Crisfield, a carver from Crisfield, so you have pockets all over the country. Not the country, but the coast here. But Chincoteague is very important. Yeah.
And as far as the decoy Chincoteague style, though, or any kind of thing that ties different carvers on the island together, before we were talking, you said you don't really think that's the case.
There's nothing. No. You can pick the eastern shore of Virginia, because people bring me old decoys that you can't identify who made them, but immediately you can tell that they're made on eastern shore. One of the few things from there for old decoys you could say from Chincoteague is they're made of cottonwood. They call it cottonwood here, and it's actually Royal Polonia is what that tree is. Kansas is full of cottonwood, but it's not the same cottonwood that we consider cottonwood. It's a tree that was brought here in colonial times, and actually the seeds it was the modern, or it was the antique style of peanuts, the old plastic peanuts that we put into our packaging material. That's how they shipped their belongings, China and such. And the seed pods was what they packed them in. And Williamsburg, full of these so-called cottonwood trees. They're Royal Polonia. What country they're from? I think they're European. And if you see a decoy that's made of cottonwood, an old one, it's Eastern Shore for sure, and you usually can zoom in to Chincoteague. For some reason, Chincoteague people really like to use that wood.
Why do you
But
think
they're
that
stubborn.
is?
Well, it's one of the few woods that you can carve. You know, there's not too many carved. You know, we have these loblolly pines. Cedars, we don't have cedar. The closest white cedar we have is in the Potomac Forest, and it's an endangered species, and you can't cut it from there. But the few cedar decoys that were made here on Chincoteague were usually left over from telephone poles, because the telephone poles, you know, they don't rot, and that's what they use cedar. But cottonwoods was easily available, very, very available here, because it grows this time of year. You can pick it out because it's got this wonderful purple blossom on it. It's like a mimosa.
Well, that's interesting. Well, I think that's just about all the questions I have. I've taken up probably more of your time than we thought. So, is there anything I've left out, though, that you think should be included, or something that would be useful for Kristen as she's getting ready to? She's going to listen to this as she gets ready for the exhibit, and anything else you want to add?
Not particularly. No, I don't know.
Okay, well, this has been fun. This has been interesting. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for sitting down and doing this, because I definitely learned a lot.
Yeah.
Learned a lot from it. So thank you.
But I'm an international carver, one of the few in Chincoteague.
That's right. You got to get that.
Yeah, they don't. They called me a craftsman or a duck carver. They didn't call me an artist, because artists are exempt. You bring in your artwork back and forth from overseas, it's an exempt. You're exempt. If you're a sculptor or an artist, you can bring it over.
Oh.
But if you're a craftsperson, you're paying customs on it.
Doesn't make any sense.
So I'm still having a conflict of whether I'm an artist, because look, I do use a paintbrush and I use paint.
Right.
So I consider myself, just because it's a three-dimensional piece, I'm painting on this three-dimensional piece. It doesn't, because the customs people said, oh no, art, you have to have a piece of canvas and paint. That's artwork.
That's interesting. That's an interesting